All right, we are actually much reduced in-class size today, so I hope people watching at home, hopefully we get you some good notes. All right, so first thing I'd like to do, besides getting this PowerPoint to where it needs to be, um, just a general go back over very quickly of the last parts of the notes from last class. I'm going to start back where I actually made a bit of a mistake in the notes. When I was annotating some class notes the late night before, I messed up, so to speak. So, with Martin Luther, the whole Reformation gets started in 1517, right? So, some major events that happened in the progression of that after 1517 when it got started. As I mentioned, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, had moderate powers within his own lands, in that some of the major kingdoms and their princes, dukes, whatever their title happened to be, elector, in the case of the Elector of Saxony, who is incredibly important in this case, uh, they were the ones that really had, they were so supportive of the emperor that without their consent, he had very little power. I mean, he could still raise a Catholic army, and that was a big to do, and we'll play into it shortly. But one of the first things he wanted to do, Charles V, was to kind of cut Luther off at the pass, quell it before it gets too big. And in an attempt to do that, because Luther was still living in the Holy Roman Empire at the time, in 1521, Charles V, in his power as emperor, issues a decree that he wants to have a court, a meeting with Luther to determine his, status as either outlaw or what have you. He was going to pass judgment on Luther, and this is going to happen at Worms or Worms, Worms, Worms as it's spelled, but W's or V's when you're saying things in German. So the Edict of Worms, or Diet of Worms, as it will be referred to first, the Diet, just like it's the Diet of Worms, met in 1521, and again this was to kind of put a court setting in front of Martin Luther, officially charge him with his crimes in the Holy Roman Empire against Catholicism, and in so doing, Charles kind of made very public, made more obvious that split that had been happening between a lot of the powerful princes and electors, dukes in the area, and all of the kingdoms of the Holy Roman Empire, and himself. Charles spoke French. He didn't speak German. German was the language of all of his people in the area that we're talking about right now. But the emperor himself didn't even speak the language. So this court, this Diet of Worms, was kind of an odd affair. You had a room full of people that both supported and did not like Martin Luther, all around, and he stands there and defends himself to a translator who then has to go and speak from German to French to the Holy Roman Emperor, the guy that's passing judgment on him, right? So would have been a very interesting scene to watch, I think. Charles V made no, two ways about it. He had extended kind of a white flag of truce to Luther so that he would, in fact, come in and face trial. But as I'm sure you probably figured, Charles V did not find, he was the person in charge of the trial, he did not judge in favor of Martin Luther. He didn't like the guy, made no two ways about it. And as soon as he was out of court, Luther had left Worms, there was, for no better way of saying it, an abduction. Martin Luther was in the carriage riding away from Worms, and his carriage is attacked. He is whisked away to Saxony, 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 where the elector of, Saxony, sorry, I had to check my notes, by the name of Frederick the Wise, or at least that's how we know him to history, Elector of Saxony, had arranged to abduct Martin Luther to keep him safe. Now, Frederick the Wise would die a Catholic. He was not, he was not converted by Luther, but he also saw that most of the lower nobles, almost all of the farmers, and pretty much all of the peasants had been listening for those 5 years since Luther published his 95 Theses. A lot of printing presses by that time had churned out a lot of what we would see today as propaganda, both for and against Protestantism, Luther in particular. He's frequently depicted as either, singing with the angels or being played by a demon. So you can kind of, if you're not literate enough to read the news that's being printed, you can at least interpret, okay, so this Luther guy is bad, or you feel the other way, ooh, we like Luther. So with that, he spends a few years, again, about 8 years, certainly not prison, but kind of a secret captive in Saxony, in one castle in particular. He uses this time to do a lot of his influential writings, and of course, those writings are disseminated throughout the kingdoms, and more people, more commoners especially, continue to convert in that sense to Lutheranism. So, there's a quick connect there. In this time, he translated the Bible into German, the New Testament. So again, there had been in Catholicism, the priests were really the only ones who could read Latin. So they were the only ones who could tell you what was in the Bible. Well, that really led to a lot of abuse of power by Catholics and nobles alike. Oh yeah, it says it on page, 300 and whatever. You don't count that high. That we can charge you taxes on every pig that you have. Says so in the Bible, right there. And if you can't read the Bible and you're worried about your eternal soul, well, you're kind of compelled to pay those taxes, right? When Luther translated it into the language of the people, besides encouraging a lot of people to become more literate, he also encouraged, through book sales, they sold these books, this new translation. In 1534, it became like a bestseller. Now, all of the people that bought it were able to at least find someone in their general vicinity that could read it. You actually get a lot of public speakers coming out of this time too, because if you're the one person in here that can read, you got 10 people around you going, hey, you know what? You want to know what the Bible actually says about taxation? Because I can read it now for myself in print. You got a lot of power. And when you start telling the people what it says, they listen and go, why are we paying taxes? These Catholic guys and all of these nobles that are Catholic too say that we owe them because it said so in the Bible. But I just read the book and it doesn't have it anywhere in there. You kind of see how over, hundreds of years of that abuse, when people realize they've been being duped in a religious sense, why they might get a little angry. Yeah, I know I would have been, but besides the point. That led to really Germany's first revolution of a sort, that, publication of the German Bible, or the Bible in German if you prefer. And this was called the Peasants' War. Now, Luther, and I'm not going to bore you with all the details because it's not going to pop up on your exams, but just for the note of having the knowledge, Luther at this time kind of loses some credit with the lower classes because the peasants were the ones revolting. Well, while they were unhappy about the price of bread, so to speak, or the taxes they paid on it, Luther was being protected by the people that they were rebelling against. So, do you turn your back on the guy that's been protecting you from the emperor who wants you dead for almost a decade? Or do you turn your back on the common people that, let's be honest, you're pretty well taken care of? So what do you think Martin Luther did? He didn't side with the people. He very much decided it was better to stay truthful to, Frederick the Wise, his patron in that sense. And he definitely told, all of the nobles, hey, you got to put this rebellion down. Like, I know they're Protestants. I know they're rebelling because of stuff I said and wrote and ideas that I put in play. But y'all gotta squish this right now. So Luther kind of loses a little credit in my mind and in the minds of a lot of the German peasants as well, mind you. But yes, so in that, I wanted to add that to the notes. Fast forward a little bit. Beginning in 1546, Holy Roman Emperor, again, Catholic Charles V, began to wage war on the Protestant principalities, Saxony especially. So when that war started, again, the Bible was translated in 1534. So 12 years after that, Charles begins again, I want to recollect my empire. I want to be the guy in charge again. So he gathers Catholics, militaries. A lot of people supported him in his own lands still. And he went to go and retake those Protestant kingdoms. Well, he had early success. He was actually a pretty good military planner. Like Charles V was not a great emperor because he didn't speak the language of his people. But as far as a military tactician, he at least had some guys influencing him that knew what they were doing. Because they had a few years of early successes where Protestantism looked like it might get squished. Until, and this is where I made a mistake. Last class I said the French came in. And the French, I believe, will come in later under Cardinal Richelieu in a similar capacity, but that's a bit later. The guy who really saved the bacon of the Protestants in this encounter with Charles would be a guy by the name of Anheuser, like Anheuser-Busch, the beer company, but the same last name. He came in and he was Sweden's king. He was well loved, hugely thought of as, again, a military tactician. And he came in with his Protestant troops from Sweden, not France. Again, my apologies. And definitely came in and saved the coalition of the Protestant princes. So together, they turned the tides of the war, rather, against the Catholics. And as I mentioned in last class, and this is where I want to pick up really for this one, the Peace of Augsburg that I mentioned in 1555, so again, several years of fighting, about 9 years of fighting, results in Charles being forced to recognize Luther had already died by this point, so the religion that Luther started, Lutheranism, as a valid religion. Very good. And that the choice between Catholicism and Protestantism could be made on a case-by-case basis by the rulers of the different kingdoms, the different territories. Okay, very good. That's about where we left off. Last class, I think we mentioned witchcraft at the very end of the notes. So I guess from here on out, these are the new notes for today. Catch this up, get y'all through Calvin and Calvinism again. We did the two compared, Anabaptist, etc. on those. We did Church of England, yes. The reason I'm splitting it into three is because England is going to be the focus and Russia of our Tuesday class, and the failure of the autocratic government to stay in control of England for very long. You still had a monarchy, but it became split much earlier between a parliamentary kind of a republican system and the monarchy still in charge. So that's why we're going to spend more of a whole day on England. But in general, with England, I summed up Henry VIII wanted to get divorced. Pope didn't want him to get divorced. Henry said, the heck with you, I'm getting divorced. Formed the Anglican Church, and then had 5 wives after that. So that's the nutshell. We'll crack it later.
Do you post these PowerPoints on Blackboard?
I do. I actually pulled it up today through Blackboard just to make sure that it was appearing. Absolutely. They're in the week designations. We're in week 4 still, so this one is week 4. I believe this is actually a much later rendering of that 1921 meeting at the trial for Luther, the Diet of Worms. Again, I think this is certainly painted years and years after that, but more or less that's the setup. You've got the one guy translating in the middle from what ostensibly I'm guessing Luther is saying to the jury, and then the translator would go and speak to the emperor. Even in the painting rendition, you could see that as very intimidating setup to be put on trial for your life under. I believe we already covered that last, or at least I left it up for a few moments if y'all would like to copy it down again. We'll discuss each of those a little bit, especially Russia and again England in our Tuesday's class. But what I would like to focus on a bit more today is the 17th century crisis and rebuilding, which France will definitely play a big role in. All right, very good. I just wanted to make those corrections, especially in case I asked a question about it on a later assignment, that I wouldn't be given the wrong answer because I gave you all the wrong information. So, the social order and peasant life of the time. Let's just talk about that. That's where we'll start 17th century crisis and rebuilding notes. It wasn't great to be a peasant. I mean, food was scarce, taxes were high. Autocratic leaders were forming huge standing armies that really reduced the ability of, like before, if you didn't like your king and you got enough locals together to form a small militia, you might be able to, enforce your will a little bit on your local monarch. The monarchs are starting to build those standing armies that make that nearly impossible. Standing armies mean that they're trained, they've got the best equipment because the king wants them to have the best equipment, and it really eliminates the power behind the peoples forming small groups of unhappy groups that would then turn into large rebellions. Urban peasants began to abandon the larger cities. So you see kind of a mass exodus from the cities back out to farming life. Again, if the cities are not going to be able to provide what you need to survive and sustain and grow your family, you typically try to find the better option. In this case, leaving the cities and going to more of a agricultural life again. Governments began to exercise more control over their populaces in general. Again, I have that as a note for pretty much all of these monarchies, so just let it go ahead and click in now. The general social order in Europe went something to the effect of king, queen, monarch on top, typically king very much at this time. Religious leaders, again, sometimes they were the same thing, Church of England especially, but the Pope controlled his own kingdom and papal army. So you could see him as a political and religious figure at the time, very much so. He was, of course, the top of Catholicism as a whole, too. So he was a bit higher standing as far as numerically speaking than Henry was as head of Church of England, but still, they shared a couple of similarities. Nobles from preferred bloodlines would be like the next step down. So, you are born to the right household and you have standing by birth. So right under religious leaders, you have the landed nobility. Under that, you had what would be called military nobles. Now, this is new because, again, you have standing armies, if not for the first time in Europe in a long time. So with those armies and respect for what they do, they grow your empire for you. The people that lead those armies, by virtue of what they do, tend to get a lot more respect from the king. Well, when you get respect from the top, you tend to float above the rest, right? Not as high, perhaps, as people that were born, again, heavy air quotes for sarcasm here, born socially better, but the military nobility was definitely a step above the rest, right? Beyond that, you had artisans and farmers, which again might be somewhat interchangeable in the grand scheme of things, depending on which society we're looking at. Then you had the independent and unlanded between the farmers, so even another social step there. You had people that owned their own farm versus people that were just tenants on land that worked for their sustenance and the taxation that they paid towards the landowners. Then you had peasants, which, again, brutal lifestyle. And in some cases, especially Russia, beneath peasants, you would have serfs, which were tied to the land. They were slaves in name and in reality, or not name, but in reality. They called them serfs. They came with the land. Yes, sir.
What's the difference between a peasant and a serf or serf?
Honestly, I'd have to go back in and do more thorough research, but one that I would know would stand is peasants are not like peasants. If you could save up whatever means you could do and choose to move to another village or another town or another city, you had that freedom as a peasant. If you were a serf, you were indentured, you were tied and bound to the land. So if the land was sold, you came with the land. There's actually a really funny book that came out around the Russian Revolution or a little after that was a commentary, about 400 pages of it, called Lost Souls by Gogol, I believe. That stands up in my mind. But it's a very dark comedy about the concept of, fake nobles or a fake noble going around and buying the list of dead names of dead serfs because, again, they were by the government tied to the land that they were on. Now, beyond that, and I don't know much beyond that, so forgive me, as that is something I'd have to read further on. But the concept of that book is, again, very dark, very funny. But they build up respect by buying the names of serfs that had already died, and then using those as lists of serfs that they had control over. So again, it's slave in reality, but it's not in name. I think there were some slight flexibilities in what you could do of your own volition. Like, I don't think they could split up families with serfs. Like, if you had a family unit, then your landlord didn't have the power to like sell your child to another kingdom. I don't think. So that would be one comparative that I could make. But beyond that, I'd have to do more research. Always with the good questions, sir. So deference to anyone higher than you on that chain, on that hierarchy, was implied. Like, if you were even a bad-mouthed farmer, you knew better than to insult the noble that walked in front of you. You might hate the guy, you might hate for what he stands for and the taxes you pay to him, but you knew you bit your tongue, because the ramifications for insulting that social order, again, various in different kingdoms, but in general, was very strict. So laws go into place where in England, I can remember there's a list of like 400 hangable offenses, and some of them go from like, murder all the way down to hurling an insult at someone that is in a higher class than you, a certain number of times. Like, they would actually hang you for that at certain points. So yeah, again, social mobility at this point was a myth. Like, you were born into a certain way of life, you died in that certain way of life in most of Europe. I think that's why a lot of the, romances of the time, especially modern ones now, get written where that love happens between someone of the higher social standing and someone of the very low peasantry, because it so defied the odds that, they understood that to be like, yeah, when pigs fly, right? That's never going to happen. That's why it made good literature. All right. So again, I mentioned this sporadically through other classes, so I won't dwell on it. Another force that really changed a lot at this time beyond social unrest, a lot of the reason for the social unrest would be the environmental changes, the Little Ice Age. I've mentioned it so many times, I'm just going to say it at that. Crops failed, things got wet, disease spread more readily, population stagnated, urban centers closed down. There. That's it. 5 little bullet points for the Little Ice Age. Constant resurgence of the plague, if you want to throw that in there. So yeah, this is something that, again, side note, with COVID and things like that we still deal with today, it makes me really nervous looking back in history because, yeah, we're scientifically, medically more advanced now, so hopefully that'll help. But the plague, keeps resurging. The Black Death keeps resurging throughout like the 1500s, 1600s, late, into the 1800s in some cases. We still have cases of bubonic plague in America today out in the Midwest. Apparently groundhog fleas are pretty bad about still carrying it. So yeah, like with pandemics that we're dealing with now, it's kind of like, oh God, how long are we actually going to have to deal with this, y'all? Black Death held on for a long time. Either way, some of the economic changes that I'd like to highlight for the point of your notes, you might want to subtitle this economic changes. The trade networks that had united all of these different kingdoms, again, post 1492, the Columbian Exchange that we mentioned in previous classes, again, that had united the world in a very round sense. You could go from, Middle East to India to China, around to the other side, South America, up the coast, eventually to North America, back around to England, to the islands, and to mainland Europe. I missed a few stops in there, but the general notion is, as those trade routes became established, there was nowhere in the world, there were plenty of places, but on those trade routes, the kingdoms that touched them, none of them were really that much more, powerful in trade than the others at this point. When instability happened in one of the major empires, though, with those shared trade networks, instability tends to spread along trade lines. Shortages from things that people have become dependent on result in either the local population making the things that they are now missing in their own way, or getting very angry about the high prices that they have to pay because getting less means higher prices. So economic factors, the Netherlands alone remained fairly unscathed at this point. So just by virtue of their stance in the world where they were, They, for whatever reason, remained fairly economically unscathed. Women were frequently the leader of what would be called the various bread revolts at the time. So whenever there's a shortage of any food, really, but for the purpose of history, they're typically called the bread revolts. Women typically were the leaders of these, so that's something that we'll tie into back a little bit later. And they normally grew again into uprisings that were then put down by the new standing armies. So this was a very bloody time in history, even without the 30 Years' War and without the civil wars that we're going to discuss. So, yes, with that, the social crises that came through at the time. By the 1640s, these revolts, the bread revolts especially, had caused mass instability in colonial holdings throughout Europe. So again, we saw the England, Spain, a lot of these countries, pretty much everybody but Russia, started establishing colonies of themselves in other places to bring in, the wealth of mercantilism. Well, with that, you had a lot of those holdings, those colonies rebelling at the same time, and we'll call it circa 1640s. This was especially true in Spain, which is relevant to this that's up on the board right now. Spain lost control of Portugal, which was crushingly bad for them as far as an economic stance, because the discovery of the Spanish super silver mines in their colonies in the mid 1540s, about 100 years before this, those mines had started to dry up, and that heavy reliance on Spanish silver out of their colonies had led to a lot of bad decisions on behalf of the Spanish nobles in regards to, oh, well, we're all rich. Why do we need to focus on building economies here? Like, the poor can just take care of themselves and we'll live very well because we're rich and can buy it through trade. Well, when that value that they had in silver starts drying up, Spain is racked with rebellion revolutions from the bottom up. So Spain lost control of Portugal. They would lose control of the remaining bit of the Netherlands that, again, they had controlled. I mentioned last class, and the guy that's up here right now, Philip II, he had inherited from his father, maybe his grandfather, forgive me, Charles V, the Holy Roman Empire. So he was the crowned head of the HRE, Holy Roman Empire. He was also the head of Spain at the time, and Spain held the crown of the Netherlands. So he had 3 crowns, all his own. But by the time, shortly after his death, and I believe during his life, the Netherlands would become, again, entirely independent. So France and England would also lose their monarchical heads to lower class rebellions. Again, French Revolution we'll talk about later, but they were all about making with the choppy. In fact, they had an invention called the guillotine, which I'm sure you're all somewhat familiar with in historical terms, that did the choppy very effectively, so much so became known as the nation's razor. They beheaded many a person, including their monarch and his wife, Marie Antoinette. That's one of the later Louis. We'll talk about one Louis today. So with these monarchies crumbling, again, revolution was in the air, and the result of that would be the 30 Years' War. This was the first pan-European war. Like, we think of World War I and World War II as being, all of the nations of Europe, barely all of them, most all of them, were affected in some way by this engagement, by this war. This, the 30 Years' War, is the first time that is really going to be the way it's fought. It's massive. It's huge scale. Hundreds of thousands of people in the armies fighting at times, sometimes that many at one time. Bloody time. So this war would begin when the Holy Roman Emperor, stopped observing that Peace of Augsburg, that piece of paper from 1555 that says, hey, all you princes can choose. You want to be Protestant, you want to be Catholic. The Holy Roman Empire recognizes you. Well, he started trampling all over that agreement. So with that, the Peace of Augsburg, which allowed for the religious freedom in the Holy Roman Empire, this led to the creation of the Protestant Union. And then very shortly after, the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope formed the Catholic League. So you have Protestant Union on one side, and this is just in the Holy Roman Empire before it spreads. And then you have other people coming in and forming the Catholic League. So you have multiple nations' armies all at once joining forces. So in 1608, 1609, which is when we're going to kick this off, Spanish Catholic troops appeared in Austria to help their Catholic family. So again, you've got Spanish troops coming in now. They're traditionally, and still to this day, I believe, very heavily Catholic. Goes back a long way. 1492, they were, Ferdinand and Isabella were already heavily Catholic. Kicked out a bunch of people for not being Catholic, actually. Eventually, French Protestant forces under, here it is, Cardinal Richelieu, which, see if I've got his name up here. Oh no, I did not download the correct one. I will post it later today to answer your question, because I know I have a French Revolution PowerPoint to put up. I just didn't bring it to class. I apologize for the inconvenience, so we're just going off notes now. So, Cardinal Richelieu, which I have spelled, hopefully as your book does correctly too, Richelieu. Now again, that might not be 100% correct. Check your book, please. But leading the French Protestant forces, he joined with the Swedes, again, with Adolphus, not Anheuser, Adolphus, excuse me. Said that incorrectly earlier in class. Because Adolphus Busch is part of the original Anheuser-Busch family. I read about beer history too. That's where the miscommunication was. So their King Adolphus, King of the Swedes, came in along with the French, with Richelieu, and again turned the tides a little bit more in the favor of the Protestant forces. And in 1648, which is the ending point of the 1010 class, for whatever reason, they never know when they come in. It's because 1648 is a very important year. It's when the Treaty of Westphalia, W-E-S-T, West, P-H-A-L-I-A, Westphalia, a treaty of it, was signed. And that recognized the independence of over 300 princes in the Holy Roman Empire. So again, you have a very German-minded people forming up what was in the Holy Roman Empire, becoming a little more decidedly German in their outlook of themselves and their neighbors. Reaffirmed the Peace of Augsburg. So again, that 1555 agreement to let individual principalities choose Protestant or Catholic. It allowed for the recognition of Calvinist and Lutheran creeds both. So it was, I guess, furthered, that Peace of Augsburg was furthered in understanding. It's not just Catholic or Protestant. It's now, specific branches of Protestantism. You can choose to be Lutheran, Calvinist, Catholic. It was also under the Treaty of Westphalia that the Dutch Republic gained its freedom. So the Netherlands were lost to the Spanish crown. And 30 years of war cost Europe almost half of its rural population, though. I believe your book gives the fraction 2/5 of the rural population, which, again, is a staggeringly large number of people. We're talking in the millions here. So really reduced the number of people out in the farmlands, out in the smaller villages. There's actually a very cool book series that is based on the author's family history. So again, take that for what it is, called the Hangman's Daughter series. And it's based in the 1530s through, I guess, now the latest book would be the 1580s, I think, in the heart of Germany. And it's taken from the standpoint of a hangman. He's, in the early books anyway, the main character. And the hangman, very popular, the executioner, the town torturer, was a very unpopular, socially unacceptable character at the time. And all of his family feels the wrath of that. But again, like I mentioned earlier, there's that socially unacceptable marriage that gets talked about through the books. And you see a very strict social order that is, again, the guy who writes them is a historian, and he's basing it on, maybe complete lie, but family history that he understands to be somewhat true. And the Hangman's Daughter series is absolutely worth the read. They're, fun, hard to put down. They're good for every age group beyond, I think. We're all in the correct age groups in here to enjoy them. But so a lot of history in different parts of Europe at this time, but that's one that I know has been made into what I think would be a very cool miniseries. But I'm biased. I've read them all. So on the horizon, the changes that happen after the 30 Years' War, especially. So, war, revolution, losing that many people brings on big changes. Historical, standpoint. It's always going to happen. The rise of absolutism occurred in no small way to balance the shifting power structures that came along with the Reformation. So again, you have the Reformation making things a little bit too crazy, a little too many revolutions, few too many revolutions happen, and the monarchs that have those building standing armies happening on their beck and call, on their paycheck, kind of start deciding it's time to re-centralize power, y'all. Like, too many princes have too many small kingdoms. We got to tighten it up. So in order to do that, to reclaim control, 17th century monarchs began to grow what the book titles in bold print, so make note of it, the fiscal military states. Fiscal, money, military. So basically, taxes are raised to pay for your military, to allow your military to get modernized. So your modernized military can go and conquer other people. And then you can charge more taxes on more people, allowing for you to build a larger army and repeat the process. Now, a lot of times we're going to see monarchs overspending the amount of money that they have because they are all attached to this vainglorious idea of making theirs the most glorious kingdom. And we're going to see the kingdom of France make Versailles out of this. One of the Louis will create the greatest palace ever made to celebrate absolutism in France. And then pretty much every country after that, every kingdom after that starts forming its own greatest palace. Well, those don't come cheap. Like Louis, when he creates Versailles, takes over an entire village, town, levels it out and creates this palace that is, AUM's campus is tiny in comparison to how big this thing is. So super expensive. That comes along with trying to fight wars that were also super expensive. Either way, the fiscal military states, this is where taxes, again, feed a large standing army. Standing army takes over colonies abroad to generate more wealth, and growing stability in urban centers brought by strong centralized governments and militaries continue to feed everything and grow an ever stronger and larger military. So ideally, again, you have the authoritarian, the monarch on top, starts these militaries, and they become a self-feeding, self-growing machine. And then the government has to grow a larger bureaucracy to control that machine and raise more taxes. So there's your nobles kind of growing there. And again, military victories lead to a little bit more fame, a little more social standing. So again, you see how those hierarchies we talked about before would be established. Yeah. So I guess that would be a good place to break in your notes. Absolutist states in Western and Central Europe. Have I lost anyone right now, by the way? I'm happy to take questions or go back and re-say something if I need to repeat myself. Everybody's okay? Cool. Not pacing anyone out? Awesome. Sorry again about the PowerPoint, y'all. I've gotten where I like having them up there for you at least. So I will post it hopefully right after this class. Absolutist states in Western and Central Europe. So let's see if we have a decent map that I can at least put back up for that. I do. Awesome. So while the definition of absolutism revolves around the central power of the one, like the absolutist, like you say absolute, that is, 100%, one, the absolutist, or monarch if you prefer, it actually takes the cooperation, again, of those nobles, whether appointed by birth or through military actions. It takes their support to really give an absolutist leader their authority to rule. Now, different kingdoms at this time and different countries that are forming up, they have different relationships in their belief of, our God is chosen, or our king is chosen by God or is appointed by God. That becomes very big in the French belief system. It is like, you're not a god. They all knew that, the Louis were all very human, or else they wouldn't have decapitated them, right? But they did believe, or at least a large portion of them seemed to believe, that Louis and other French kings were appointed by God to rule on their behalf. So again, a strong religious political link there. In Spain, the Habsburg, Hapsburg, Habsburg family, which was again Austrian, was also under their crown at the time. Spain had grown wealthy on the discovery of those colonial pockets of silver that I had mentioned in 1545, about 100 years before this. And while the wealth of that silver had propped up the Spanish Empire, their military and navy had been on the decline for quite a while. They lost a huge chunk of their navy to Elizabeth I, which I think is the point of the film, Elizabeth I, Part 2, or whatever they ended up calling it. Either way, they had lost quite a lot of their military luster by this point. And when Philip IV took over, Philip IV, I think, would have been a major name on the PowerPoint had I had one. When Philip IV took control in 1621, again of Spain, industry had been allowed to decline in Spain for a long, long time, or at least, 80 odd years. Again, when they had as much silver, and I mean, they were the world leader in silver, y'all. Spain had gotten fabulously wealthy on silver, so much so that there had stopped being any reliance on an artisan culture. Like, not a lot of great art comes out of this time that is from Spanish artists because, they didn't really support that, in that they needed artists, but they could hire that done from somewhere else. They didn't need to. They were, again, peasants were allowed to just be peasants. The rich didn't need to support them. There was no point. They were already too rich. We didn't need the support. Silver is our support. Well, that dried up. So by 1621, again, when Philip took over, it was pretty much, the precipice in Spain was about to jump off. While Spain had become less reliant on developing infrastructure in their own country, conversely, the Dutch and the English, gosh, y'all, coffee. Can't even read my own notes. The Dutch and the English were only growing stronger. So again, you see a big military naval defeat of the Spanish naval armada at the hands of the English in Elizabeth's, early reign, which is not long after this. By 1609, the Spanish crown was also expelling the Moors from their own kingdom. So again, religious differences. Moors were typically, they were always practicing Muslim Islam. I believe typically they were from Africa, so they had they would be what we call today black, as far as black Moors, I think, is a term I remember from history classes past. Just go ahead and relate it, but they were Muslims, and again, a very Catholic king did not like having Muslims, regardless of what color they were, in his kingdom. So the Spanish crown, again, not terribly religiously tolerant, kicked them out. However, they had also been, those Moors, M-O-O-R-S, Moors, had been some of the most skilled artisans and creators in the kingdom. So really kind of, what's the saying? Cut off his nose to spite his own face, or something like that. Coupled with the decline in the amount of silver, and again, much of it had been stolen at this point by English and Dutch privateers on the open seas, Spanish landlords had to increase their rents to compensate for their economic losses. What typically happens when you increase rents unreasonably? Revolution, or at least unrest, typically leads to revolution. So bad was it that Spain, as a government at the time, declared bankruptcy numerous times. Just said, nope, don't have it. Don't have the money. Can't do it. Check my time. All right. Got about 20 minutes left. Yes, we are more than good. All right. Does anyone need to stand up for a second, take a stretch? I'm sorry. I'm just kind of droning today. I do apologize. We're all good? Cool. Good deal. I guess that would end the Spanish discussion for now. Let's turn our attention to French absolutism, which, again, if you travel to France, you can still see just beautiful examples of the very expensive creations of the French monarchs from this period. At this point, France, and we're talking the early 17th century, was very, very weak. Right? They didn't have much of a standing military. They didn't have much of a navy. France was kind of the, scrawny kid on the playground that no one wanted to have on their team at this time, right? Henry IV, Henry the Fourth of the House of Bourbon. He would be the first of the Bourbon house, which becomes important later on for later rulers, and the descendancy and who gets to control the French and the English crowns. All of this is tied into several factors, but this guy right here. So, sorry, just trying to let y'all catch up. Henry IV, first of the House of Bourbon, signed the Edict of Nantes, Nantes, Edict of Nantes, in 1598. What this did in France was extend a small amount of religious tolerance to the Huguenots, the French Protestants that were still within the borders. He also began charging the rich more to provide for a better built infrastructure. So Henry IV starts looking like he might be okay with, helping out at least the peasants. Making better infrastructure is good for several things, moving your military quickly, but it helps trade, which helps people gain more money, which gives them a better lifestyle, right? He made roads, many castles, which employed many people. So I mentioned castles and roads, both because they provide enormous amounts of jobs, and skilled labor comes out of this. That, again, you start building a lot of castles, you start learning very quickly what works and what doesn't work. There's this great YouTube available British video or British show that ran from like the 80s all the way through the mid 2000s thus far, a couple of years ago, called Time Team. And a lot of the episodes revolve around them going to these French and early English castles and discovering things about them, digging up the past, so it is. But there's one that is a spin-off show from that where 3 of the people from it actually live a full year in a part of France where they're rebuilding by these ancient techniques, by hand, this enormous castle and all of the grounds around it. And they spend this entire year, they document it all the way through. They wear period clothing, they use period tools only, and they've got to learn how to survive. Obviously they wouldn't let them die, but they've got to learn how to live by the means of the time very quickly. And in that show, you get to see a lot of the cool parts of the architecture. Castles, when you look at them from the outside, just these, and the ones that I've seen anyhow, these huge structures in front of you. And then you get to walk inside them. They've got these tiny little spiral staircases and these little tiny details. It's like, wow, this must have taken forever to build. Yes, they did take a long time, but the point of mentioning it in an economic sense is they also, to get them done in a person's lifetime, had to hire a lot of people, a lot of stonemasons, a lot of bricklayers. You had to make the bricks before you could even put them in place. So you had to have kilns and you had to have all of these other things. So again, very big industry in Henry's movements of making roads and castles. Benefited a lot of people. Sadly, Henry was killed by a Catholic assassin in 1610. Very forward-thinking guy for his time in a lot of ways, fairly religiously tolerant. Well, you had to have that one person, right? So a Catholic came along and assassinated the heck out of him in 1610. This brought in, who would become later in notes, we've already mentioned, Cardinal Richelieu. So Richiel, ruled on behalf of the now very young king, who would be Louis XIII, because again, his father, Henry, had been assassinated when Louis was, I want to say, 4 or 5 years old, something like that. Richelieu did well by the monarchy. He actually, besides being a good leader, put a lot of things in place for the monarch to maintain his, standing. He divided, the holdings of France into 32 distinct regions that each one, again, had a local governor that reported to the crown. So, again, he just started organizing things in France in a lot better way that would beget a lot more advances that lead to them becoming the powerhouse by the end of the 17th century, instead of, again, the scrawny person on the playground that no one wanted to play with at the beginning. About 100 years in France makes all the difference. And then another 100 years, it would be a lot more different. But anyway, we'll get to that later. By doing this, increasing the number of territories that relied on the crown and directly reported to it, he reduced the power of the local nobles. You don't let them meet up as frequently, and you divide it to where there's more of them that control less space. And it's a little bit more stable in that they have a harder time getting enough people together to rebel against the crown. So, forward-thinking guy, Cardinal Richelieu. He also pushed the Habsburgs, again, that big important Austrian family in control of a lot of the areas around France. He pushed them out from the borders surrounding France, and that was, again, during the 30 Years' War, where he was very instrumental on the Protestant side towards forcing Charles V and the Catholics into signing their way out. Cardinal Richelieu kind of developed a standing pattern. When a king would die and leave a very young heir, a religious figure would frequently step in and rule on behalf of that heir for at least until they became old enough to rule. I'd say teenage years, I think, is when they typically flipped it. So after the fall of Richelieu and his following king, you then have a guy named Cardinal Jules Mazarin, which is Mazarin. Mazarin. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that one. I apologize. And he followed the example of Cardinal Richelieu by becoming the advisor to a young king, in this case, Louis XIV. Louis XIV was 4 years old when he was crowned. You're going to follow a 4-year-old if you're the nobles? Not so much. Not so much. I mean, it might be fun for a day, but your kingdom's not going to fare well. So it certainly makes sense to have someone come in. But why not a mom, for instance? Well, this was an idea that the king's mother had. Maybe she, or as it happened to be, an Austrian aunt, was trying to sit the throne for him being a very young Louis XIV. Mazarin decided that he didn't like this Austrian aunt sitting on the throne in place of the young king that he could sit on the throne in place for. So a little bit of a violent time for a couple of years called the Fronde, Fronde. I believe it's one of your highlighted terms. Resulted, and that was, again, ostensibly because there was a religious difference between the Austrian aunt and the Cardinal Mazarin. But really, you can look at it as a religious difference or just a matter of wanting to control the French crown until Louis became old enough to rule for himself. Either way, this Austrian aunt was deposed, and Mazarin, ruled instead for Louis until he became old enough. And it was this guy, Louis XIV, that we're going to talk about next. So let me do my time check. I'm going to run it for about 10 more minutes, and then I think we'll be all right for today. And we'll be to a good stopping point. So everybody is still moderately good. I know this is not the most interesting stuff when we go at this quick pace, but I try and keep it fun at least. So Louis XIV, the sun god, or sun king rather, not sun god, I apologize. Whew, come to me, coffee, I need you. The sun king was really the first guy that we associate with absolutism, that type of monarchical rule in France. He was able to come to power because the instability that was caused by that religious disagreement, the Fronde that I just mentioned a moment ago, Mazarin, all of those fellas. Under Louis, there would be a new concept for the monarch, the divine right of kings. So again, divine, you've got that religious annotation right there. Then right of kings, okay? Louis came up with a pretty good idea because he balanced it in that he is not only, it established that God alone was above the king. Okay, so it's not saying that your king is a god, right? There's a huge difference. You go back to other cultures where that's true, and it's a little bit different feel. But Louis established that he was appointed by God to rule on behalf of the French people, and the flip of that is under the eyes of God for him. So he felt an honest and religious pull to do, by a measure of the time, right by his people. If you're being looked at by God and chosen to rule and you're a religious person, do you want to do bad stuff and displease the guy that just put you in power? Not so much. No, you don't. You want to, at least in Louis's mind, rule with at least a fair hand towards your subjects. So divine right of kings, while it sounds like you're making yourself super high and mighty, in Louis's mind was kind of a balancing factor. Like, yeah, I have this heavy weight of being chosen by God to rule over y'all. Like, I got to make the right decisions. Louis was a hard worker. He traveled through his kingdom constantly. He wasn't always the best of rulers, but he was a long-lived one. We'll get to that in a little bit. But as a good ruler, he never really called the Estates General. Now, write down that. Estates General, estates, just like it is today, spelled like estate sale, and general. This was a three-part, like we think of the U.S. government as two houses of power, Senate. This is different from that. This is a three-part government where each estate, each of the three estates, had representatives that came forward and spoke at a general assembly of the first estate, which was the clergy, about 1% of all of the French people. Then you had the second estate, the nobility, that's 2% of the French people. And then you had representatives of everybody else, 97% of the French people. So this Estates General, whilst balanced in that everybody had a say in it, everybody being the different levels of society, each group got one vote for their representatives. So you got 97% of the people represented with one vote, and you've got 3% of the people on top represented by 3%, but 2 votes. Does that seem very fair? Not really. You think it's going to last very long? Not really. But Louis did not call that group together to meet at all. So if you don't call the representatives to vote on anything, as a king, you don't have anyone to answer to. So again, he was a smart monarch. He knew what to do to have a, strongest support is one that you don't have to consult, right? You don't ask them any questions. They can't tell you what you don't want to hear. General thought of Louis. It was also France's political pressure valve. It let off the steam, so to speak. So in not letting them meet, long run, this would be very bad for future monarchs of France. But it did become kind of a set standard practice. Just don't let the Estates General meet. They can't say anything bad. They can't come up with new ideas of revolution. We'll worry about it later. So in that Louis was not the best of rulers, he revoked the Edict of Nantes that we mentioned earlier in notes and forced out 200,000 French Protestants, those Huguenots that we mentioned earlier, that were allowed to stay in France by virtue of Nantes. The Sun King, Louis XIV, ruled for 54 years. Again, a lot of people at this time that were peasants didn't live 2/3 the length of time that he ruled as a king. So, most people then died in their 30s and 40s, especially if you were not well off or a peasant, maybe even younger than that. This guy ruled for 54 years. I mean, yeah, he came to the crown young, but still. 33 of those 54 years were spent fighting. Whereas at this time, if you won, gained you property, gained you empire, and gained you money. But someone had to pay for them at home. If you keep on fighting them, they get too expensive. Something that the U.S. is recognizing right now with our Middle East policy. Not to get too political or too modern. Louis was always in need of more money to fight more wars. He tripled and then updated the French military. So not only did he increase the size of it threefold, he also bought them the newest, shiniest toys and weapons. Outfitted these guys to the hilt. You think of the Three Musketeers movies. Any of y'all ever seen those where all of the troops are in like very well made uniforms, very bright colors. Everybody's carrying around like shiny metal weapons and, might have a shiny helmet on. That's like how he was trying to make it. He wanted the best and shiniest, and he wanted the best military, and a huge one at that. Again, though, you can only raise taxes so much. In his attempts to expand, he brought a Europe-wide military revolution in spending, so much so that all of the competitors, England, Holy Roman Empire, the German princes, all of these people felt compelled to buy their military the newest stuff too. Well, if you outfit your military with the newest, bestest stuff, and the next door neighbor starts doing that too, typically makes people nervous, right? You don't want your next door neighbor building up his military. What are they doing that for? They're gonna invade us? Well, we better start building up our military just in case. So again, you see that growth of that military fiscal state in a lot more places. Taxes get raised to build that military. Military's got to support got to support itself through taking in land, taking in empire. You have more money to spend, you have more to tax, you build more, they take more. Anyway, in that, he created this Europe-wide kind of standardization of military. This was between the, call it 1660s and 70s. This was good for France, again, for a while. It makes you look good. You're able to conquer more people and bring in enough money to support it. Louis's final war, though, the War of Spanish Succession, where, who's going to sit on the Spanish crown? I don't know, but let's fight about it. Louis decided that he needed to get France involved in that squabble. And this is where Louis can kind of be seen as just like a little whiny kid in history. He had no business going and trying to affect the succession of Charles II in Spain. Like, no reason to do it. It didn't benefit him. It didn't hurt him in any way. I mean, it did hurt him because he lost, major battles in regards to it. But the Peace of Utrecht, which is, again, one of those words you should probably write down, Utrecht, 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 ended the War of Spanish Succession. The Dutch, the English, the Austro-Hungarian Prussians formed the Grand Alliance, and they, defeated the heck out of France. So Louis, again, who had no real business getting involved in the War of Spanish Succession, got pretty much all of the other major powers ganged up against him and just squashed him. So, check my time again. We got 5 minutes. It's going to end right where I wanted to. Perfect. All right. The absolutist palace, I mentioned it earlier. Versailles was definitely the one that leads the way in that regard. If you are a monarch, you want to be able to show how powerful you are. The best way to do that is always going to be have the biggest, flashiest palace, the biggest, flashiest military. So with that, in 1682, Louis XIV began to hold court at his palace in Versailles. Now, when I say palace, again, think of the grandest thing you've ever seen and double it. This was his way, Louis's way, of controlling his nobles. Now, one, you physically control where they go and what they do when you're at the palace. I mean, like 700 bedrooms of palace, y'all. So you have that many people there that are all influential families at one time. Those court parties that you hold become where the big business deals are made. That's where all the political alliances and allegiances are built, are at Versailles under Louis's watchful eye. So if any of you ever watched the DiCaprio film, The Man in the Iron Mask, they set a lot of that, because that's one of the Louis, at Versailles. So if you haven't, it's actually a not awful movie. I won't say it's good, but it's a not awful movie. And it does give you an idea of the grandeur of just Versailles alone. But it also gives you an idea of how he used the control of what people were doing in his palace and the etiquette that he enforced. Like that, if you broke a rule, then you got kicked out. And if you got kicked out, you weren't there to make that deal that was going to make your family richer. So if you weren't there to get richer, you get poorer, and then you're not invited back to court. So you see how following those rules that Louis sets up at Versailles becomes super important to all of the nobles, It's how he controls them. It's how he makes them give him money and support him in all of his military ventures. So the grandeur that was inspired by Versailles, as I've mentioned 3 or 4 times now, was infectious. It was a European-wide court. It's where Louis invited any dignitaries, any kings, monarchs, princes, etc., to come in and visit him when they were in France, do any of his political biddings. So yeah, it was incredibly influential. Bankrupted the heck out of a lot of countries making those palaces. But hey, that's where we're going to end today. Thank y'all very much.